I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is a Fear and Greed extended interview. All the other good bits we couldn't fit into the daily podcast. If you're looking for the daily episode of Fear and Greed, check the podcast playlist. Otherwise, enjoy the interview. This morning, I welcome back to the Fear and Greed virtual studio, Conal Hanna, Media Partnerships Lead at Streem. Streem, of course, is a wonderful sponsor of Fear and Greed, and in my view, the best media monitoring service in the country. And Conal knows as much about trends in the media as anyone I know. Good morning, Conal.
Hello, Sean. Great to be with you again.
We're 3 months through, a quarter of the year down. What are the big stories so far?
Yeah, that's right. So we thought with Easter coming up, it might be a good chance to have a look at the biggest stories for the first 3 months of the year. And there's a couple of different ways of measuring it. In terms of quantity, the story that's generated the most media this year is the vaccine rollout, which is probably understandable. But then when you take into account prominence, and we looked at online, looking at the top of all the news websites over the course of the year, and the treatment of women has actually overtaken the vaccine rollout as the number one story of the year now.
Yeah, I suppose that's not that much of a surprise. These sorts of issues are long-running issues. Every day you're basically getting something about vaccines, and certainly over the last 6 to 8 weeks, every day you're getting something about the way that the government has treated women and allegations of rape, etc. Do they actually have single days where they are the biggest stories, or is it more accumulation effect?
Yeah, look, both those stories obviously have been long-running stories and will probably continue for some time yet to come. But they also have big spikes in between. So obviously, one of the biggest days of the year news-wise was when Christian Porter came out and said he was the MP at the centre of rape allegations aired by the ABC. That was a huge day, for example. The number one biggest day, though, interestingly, was not that. The most stories about a topic in a single day in terms of online was the News Media Bargaining Code and the day Facebook blocked news in Australia. That created a huge buzz in the industry and was the number one story at the top of news websites for large parts of that day.
I think that's a reflection of the impact that was having and the players that it was impacting, because for the general population, I dare say, that story is not as big as the government and the vaccine rollout.
Yeah, I think there was probably a couple of elements at play here. So how we defined this is how much time they took up of the top 10 spots in online on their news website homepages. So basically what you've got here is there were lots of elements to the Facebook story. Obviously, it affected news companies quite heavily, but you also had a lot of other people caught up in that ban. You'll probably remember charities, health organisations, other people were caught up and had their Facebook pages blocked as well. So, yeah, it generated quite a lot of wide-ranging discussion and coverage.
What about business stories this year?
Yeah, look, so the News Media Bargaining Code is also the biggest business story of the year so far. Behind that, we've got the end of JobKeeper, and I think everyone's quite anxious watching how that's going to go. There's quite a large expectation that there'll be pretty significant job losses. And then behind that, you've got Crown Casino. Obviously, they're having a pretty challenging start to the year. The GameStop share price rise in America. And lastly, the house prices in Australia, which are really starting to escalate quickly.
Mostly in business stories, is it those sort of bigger trend things like house prices, investing, that type of thing that ends up getting more attention than specifically a company? Now, Crown Resorts obviously has had a big year because royal commissions and inquiries in New South Wales and takeover offers from Blackstone, specifically that has had a lot going on. But mostly is most of the concentration on thematics, I suppose, rather than individual companies.
I think so. When you're looking at an exercise like this where you're covering 3 months of media coverage, you're picking out the big themes that have emerged over the course of the year, maybe rather than individual stories. When we often do an annual year in review as well, and it's very challenging for one very hot button topic to match the coverage that's something that's in the media for a long period of time.
Yeah, okay. And there are many stories that you see that just don't get the coverage you'd expect them to get?
Look, one that really struggled for cut through this year was the debate over IR legislation in the Parliament. So that's normally a pretty hot button topic, and it involved delicate Senate negotiations. And in the end, the government had to dump 4 out of the 5 reforms they were proposing. Normally, I would have expected that to get a lot more wide-ranging coverage, but obviously this year it was just totally derailed by the conversation about the treatment of women in Canberra. You had the Attorney General actually have to stand aside while that bill was being introduced into Parliament. And so that actually has only received about 2 or 3% of the attention that the treatment of women in the past 6 weeks has gotten. So it gives you a sense there of how big that conversation's been.
Yeah, pretty incredible, because last year that would have been a very highly rated story for a period, that the IR reforms, because Scott Morrison came out and made a really big thing of it, as did Christian Porter.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, the government was dealing with a difficult Senate. It was going to be a hard negotiation anyway, but when they lost their chief negotiator, it probably became even more difficult.
Stay with me, Conal. We'll be back in a moment. My guest today is Conal Hanna, Media Partnerships Lead at Streem. Now, moving on to the New Zealand travel bubble. It's coming up to Easter, as you mentioned, and lots of us have holiday plans. Now, some have been somewhat scuttled by what's happened in Queensland. And Conal, I know your holiday plans are potentially scuttled about what's happened in Queensland. The New Zealand travel bubble, though, is something that's been long talked about, but it doesn't exist yet. What can you tell us about that and what people are saying about that?
Yeah, so the background to this one is we've got some frustrated skiers and snowboarders in our office, and they suggested maybe we should delve into the reporting about the New Zealand travel bubble. And the results have been quite interesting because we monitor New Zealand media as well, and we can compare the coverage between the two countries. And this issue is just red hot in New Zealand at the moment. There's lots of frustrated tourism businesses, and the opposition's applying considerable pressure on Jacinda Ardern's government.
Jacinda Ardern last week, I think, actually delayed a decision on the bubble too.
That's right. So they're expecting a decision in early April now. I think it was April 6th. I'd expect that maybe this Brisbane situation may lead to another delay, unfortunately. Yeah. But it's just been a really hot topic in New Zealand. But interestingly, in Australia, it's actually fallen off the radar quite a lot with media companies. Coverage is down about a third compared to its normal over the last 6 months. And it's down to well below where it was last year. So to me, potentially, it's the Australian media kind of getting a bit frustrated that they're talking about this story frequently, but we're not getting any closer to a solution.
You said you cover New Zealand as well. Is it mostly a general populist debate, or is it a political debate?
Well, we obviously monitor the media interest, and while that's not a direct proxy for consumer interest, I would say that these days most of the media companies are very well attuned to the data and provide more coverage on issues that they know their readers are highly interested in. So I think what it does show is that probably New Zealand might be missing out on an opportunity to capitalise on the earned media interest. Earned media in tourism campaigns in particular can be really effective way of reaching people. And it does feel like, the peak may have passed for that story. Even though that said, I'm sure there are still plenty of Australians hoping to get over to NZ for a bit of snow time later in the year.
Some media campaigns like Tourism Australia, they used Hamish Blake and his partner Zoe, and they created a lot of earned media in the process. It was a commercial arrangement, but they did a great job getting in the news.
Yeah, that's right. I think that, everyone loves planning holidays and everyone loves reading about holidays. And the other thing that's coming up on the news agenda is the Australian government's subsidies of 800,000 flights, which they'll go on sale from next week. So that's another thing that the New Zealand travel industry might be competing with soon.
Yeah. Now, we had John Stensold on the program recently talking about the Australians' list of the country's wealthiest people. Now, you've been comparing their media profiles.
Yeah, that's right, Sean. We thought it might be a bit of fun to have a look at which are the billionaires in Australia with the biggest media profiles. And I'm going to throw this question to you. Who do you think of the top 50 richest Australians, who has the biggest media profile?
Andrew Forrest or James Packer?
Oh, very good guess, but you've actually got numbers 2 and 3 there. There's one
hold on. I've got
larger-than-life character from Queensland who you're missing.
Clive Palmer?
Yeah, correct.
Really? Why? Because he keeps suing Western Australia?
Well, I guess he is. He's certainly quite litigious, and so he comes up in a lot of court proceedings. That's true, and particularly around the border ban, he was very prominent in that debate.
I'm guessing that Andrew Forrest, founder of Fortescue Metals and a big stake in that company, probably gets most media per $1 billion.
Well, no, because Twiggy Forrest's fortune is worth so much, he kind of gets discounted a bit when you do it by $1 billion. So it's actually James Packer who's got the most coverage per billion. He's faced some unfortunate circumstances and his wealth is kind of shrinking, whereas all the iron ore magnates are seeing their wealth expand pretty rapidly. So he had the biggest year in the last 12 months. Another couple of people who were very prominent on that list, Solly Liu and Jerry Harvey, so a couple of retailers who've been very much in the news a fair bit of late, and their fortune doesn't quite compete with the iron ore magnates, but they're still pretty wealthy individuals, and they've been quite high profile the last year.
Of course, the other thing about the richest 250, as John Stensold does in The Australian, which I find really interesting, is the billionaires that you just don't know much about. Who are the reclusive billionaires? Who are the guys that don't really have much of a media profile.
Yeah, so we took the top 50 of John's list and examined their media profiles. The one who had the lowest on there was Morris Alter, the founder of Pacific Property Group. Now, to be fair to Mr. Alter, he's 95, so he's probably got a pretty good reason for not doing a lot of media these days.
He doesn't need the media.
Well, that's exactly right. And then a lot of the people in that list that also had relatively low profiles, there were quite a few heirs and heiresses. So the Reinhardt heirs, Prudence McLeod, Rupert Murdoch's daughter. And then there were quite a few dual internationals as well who may not be living in Australia but are still deemed in the 50 richest Australians.
Okay, and so which industries are more likely to be high and low profile in that sense?
So amongst the top 50, the industries that really were higher profile than average were media. Mining is still really high profile in Australia, and retail, I think particularly over the last 12 months with coronavirus, there's been a lot of coverage about retail. On the flip side, financial services and investment, manufacturing, and the property billionaires also tended to keep a relatively low profile as well.
What I think is interesting, there are probably more property billionaires, or at least people with wealth in property, who are in that list than any other sector. And I dare say they don't need to make a lot of noise about their wealth, whereas someone like Gerry Harvey has a vested interest in promoting Harvey Norman. I'm not sure that Solomon Lew thinks himself has a vested interest in promoting Premier Investments, but it certainly helps his retail outlets like Just Jeans and JJ's and Dotty and Smiggle, etc., if they do promote it.
Yeah, that's a really good way of looking at it, Sean. Obviously, earned media can be a real asset for companies who are trying to grow their footprint, and you've got some pretty astute brands there that I'm sure use earned media to full effect. When it comes to property, I guess developments can be fairly controversial, and maybe no news is good news for some of those companies.
I suspect so. Conal, thanks for talking to Fear and Greed.
Not a problem. Thanks, Sean.
That was Conal Hanna, Media Partnerships Lead at Streem.